The rain had begun before dawn, the kind that fell in long silver strands and turned the dust of Whitmore Station into a thick, clay-colored mire. Steam from the locomotive curled through the gray morning like a ghost rising from its grave, and every sound, the hiss of the brakes, the shifting of boots, the low murmur of passengers, seemed to echo against the endless plains that stretched beyond the tracks. From the last carriage stepped a young woman, her gloved hands clutching a small carpet-bag, her bonnet tilted low to shield her from the rain. She moved carefully, almost reverently, as though each footstep might disturb something sacred. Her dress was plain calico, hem darkened with mud. Her shawl, once cream, had turned the color of the road itself. Yet there was grace in her bearing, something quiet and self-contained, as if her silence were not born of fear but of deliberation. A few townsfolk had gathered, drawn by curiosity more than courtesy. Whitmore Station did not often receive strangers, much less women who arrived alone. Their eyes followed her, appraising, whispering. A boy offered to carry her bag, but she shook her head with a faint, polite smile. She seemed unsure of where to stand, uncertain of what to expect, though her eyes, clear and searching, looked toward the far end of the platform, where a tall man stood beneath the station's overhang, coat buttoned to the throat. He was her promised husband, Mr. Jonathan Price, merchant and widower, who had sent letters written in a fine hand and sealed with a red wax crest. His advertisements had been brief but hopeful. Widower seeks virtuous woman for companionship and order of home, serious inquiries only. She had replied with care, sending a photograph and a modest account of her upbringing, and his acceptance letter had come with the authority of a business contract. The arrangement was meant to bring her security and him peace. But now, as she stood before him, rain gathering in the folds of her bonnet, she could see the doubt in his eyes. He removed his hat slowly, regarding her as though she were a parcel delivered in error. "Miss," he said, his voice crisp, polite but distant. "You are." She reached into her shawl and produced his letter, edges soft from the journey. Her lips parted as if she meant to speak, but no words came. Instead, she offered the letter with both hands, head bowed slightly. Mr. Price hesitated before taking it. Around them, a murmur rippled through the crowd. "She don't speak?" someone whispered. Another voice, sharper, followed. "Lord save him. He's sent for a mute bride." Color rose to her cheeks, and she turned her face away, pretending not to hear. The words struck harder than the rain. Mr. Price's eyes flicked from her to the crowd, then back again. "You can't speak?" he asked, his tone caught between confusion and irritation. She shook her head once, lightly. He sighed, folding the letter and sliding it into his coat. "I was not informed of this." The platform fell silent except for the sound of rain drumming against tin. She wished to explain that she could speak, that silence was a choice, a protection. But her throat had long forgotten the shape of words. Each time she had tried in the past, the world had answered her with laughter or pity. So now she said nothing. "I'm sorry, miss," he said finally, stepping back. "I had imagined—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "This won't do. I can't—" He turned abruptly, calling to his driver. The horses snorted in the rain, the carriage wheels sinking deep into the mud. He climbed inside without another word. She stood motionless, the hem of her dress plastered to her ankles, her small carpet-bag growing heavier with water. The onlookers began to drift away, their curiosity sated. One woman, older and kind-eyed, approached briefly, offered a kerchief, then hesitated under the weight of pity and left it unsaid. When the train whistle sounded again, the platform emptied, and the young woman was alone. She sank onto the nearest bench, her hands folded in her lap, heart aching with the dull, familiar knowledge that she had once again become an object of charity, or worse, ridicule. The rain softened, and steam drifted lazily from the engine's belly. The world smelled of iron and wet earth. She watched her reflection blur in a puddle at her feet until all that remained was the faint outline of her bonnet and the shimmer of tears she refused to shed. A deep rumble drew her gaze to the far end of the station, where a black carriage stood apart from the others. Its driver, a man in a dark greatcoat, held the reins loosely as though waiting for someone who was in no hurry to appear. The door of the carriage was open, though no one had stepped out. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, just as she began to lower her eyes again, a gloved hand emerged, steady, deliberate, resting on the frame. The figure inside was barely visible in the gloom, but his presence seemed to still the very air. He did not move, did not speak. Yet there was something magnetic in that silence, something different from the disdain she had just endured. The hand tapped once against the doorframe, slow, rhythmic, before retreating into the shadowed interior. The driver guided the horses forward. As the carriage rolled past, its window lowered slightly, revealing a man's profile. Pale, refined, his hair streaked with silver, though he could not have been more than 35. His eyes met hers briefly, sharp, observant, and strangely serene. And then the faintest inclination of his head, a gesture not of pity, but of acknowledgment. The carriage moved on, vanishing into the mist. She sat frozen, unsure if the exchange had truly occurred, or if loneliness had conjured it from the rain. When she finally rose to her feet, her limbs felt weightless, her thoughts scattered like petals in a storm. The station master approached, clearing his throat. "Miss, train to the city's gone." "Next one's tomorrow noon," he said. "There's the Whitmore Inn up the road. Might give you a room for the night." She nodded her thanks. Her voice, unused for months, would have betrayed her anyway. He watched her walk away, the faintest frown creasing his brow. "Strange girl," he muttered, shaking his head. "Don't reckon she's from around here." The rain eased to a fine drizzle. Beyond the station, the fields stretched in endless shades of gray and green, and the wind carried the scent of wet grass and horses. She walked along the muddy road, each step heavy but determined. In the distance, a bell tolled, slow and deliberate. When she reached the crest of the hill, she turned back once more. The station lay below, quiet and still, a pocket of smoke against the morning fog. And there, far across the plain, the black carriage glinted faintly in the dim light. Waiting at the gates of a grand estate, something within her stirred, not hope, not yet, but the faint echo of it. The world had rejected her silence, but somewhere she felt someone had heard it. The road to Whitmore Hall wound through miles of wind-beaten prairie, where the grasses bent like waves beneath a pale, merciless sky. The woman rode within a covered wagon bound for the Duke's estate, though out here, even the title sounded foreign, a remnant of the old country now settled upon western soil. Word had it that the man who owned the land had come from England years ago, seeking isolation, his wealth enough to build a manor that rose like a cathedral against the horizon. When the wagon crested the last ridge, she saw it, an immense house of white stone, its chimneys spilling faint smoke, its wide verandas shadowed by oak trees imported at great cost. A river ran beyond it, glinting in the afternoon light. For a moment awe replaced her exhaustion. It was not the world she had known. The driver halted at the gate, tipping his hat toward the uniformed man who waited there. "Miss was sent for," he said. "From the station," the gatekeeper nodded, eyes narrowing as he studied her. She could read the silent judgment. Another charity case, another poor creature gathered into the Duke's peculiar household. Yet he said nothing, only waved them through. Inside the house, quiet ruled. Even the servants moved softly, as if sound itself were forbidden. A tall woman in black silk appeared at the top of the staircase, Mrs. Alcott, the housekeeper. Her expression was composed, her voice precise. "His Grace offers temporary lodging," she said. "You will dine separately, and may assist in light work if you wish." "He values order above all," the young woman nodded. She had learned to accept such conditions without protest. That night she was shown to a small chamber overlooking the gardens. It was clean but bare, its single window framing a sea of silver grass. On the dresser lay a folded note in an elegant hand. "Rest. You're safe here." No signature, only the faint imprint of a wax seal marked with an old crest. Days passed in quiet rhythm. She helped in the gardens, pruning roses and trimming vines. The air smelled of mint and cedar. The sky stretched vast and blue. Servants passed her with wary curiosity, she, the stranger who never spoke. In the evening she sometimes glimpsed the Duke from a distance. He walked the verandas at twilight, his cane striking softly against the boards, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. His hair was silver at the temples, though his face was not yet old. The first time their eyes met, she offered a cautious nod. He returned it with a faint, measured smile. She learned in whispers what others would not tell her directly, that he had once been an officer decorated and admired, that a fever had taken his hearing years ago, that his young wife, unable to bear the loneliness, had died within the very walls of Westmere Hall. Since then, the Duke had withdrawn from society, allowing only select company, choosing silence as both refuge and punishment. It was a strange thing to find herself sheltered by a man who lived in the same quiet she did. One afternoon, she returned to her room to find a parcel upon her table. Wrapped in velvet and bound by a golden thread, it bore no note, no name. She hesitated, then untied the string. Inside rested a small wooden box carved with vines and wildflowers, its surface smooth from careful hands. When she lifted the lid, a tune began to play, a soft, lilting melody, sweet as the breath of spring. She froze. The sound filled the room, trembling through the air like a living thing. She had not heard music in so long that it startled her. And yet the irony struck her. He who could not hear had sent her this. Her fingers brushed the inner lid, where a message was etched in neat script. Not all beauty must make sound. Tears gathered before she could stop them. That evening, she saw him again at dusk, standing near the garden's fountain. The sun caught the edge of his profile, strong, severe, yet softened by something fragile in his eyes. She approached hesitantly, holding the music box in both hands. When he turned, she curtsied deeply in gratitude. He read the question in her face and smiled faintly, raising a gloved hand to his ear, then shaking his head gently. He signed slowly, movements deliberate. She did not yet know his language, but she understood enough. You heard it. I did not. That is how it should be. He gestured for her to walk with him. They strolled along the path bordered by hydrangeas, the sound of the river whispering beyond. Though neither spoke, something unspoken passed between them, an ease born of mutual solitude. The servants watched from the veranda, whispers already forming. She's bewitched him, one murmured. Imagine, the mute and the deaf. Another laughed quietly. A fitting pair for a silent house. By week's end, the whispers had reached the nearby town. Tales of the mysterious woman at Westmere Hall spread quickly. Some said she was a widow, others a foreigner, others still a trickster who'd ensnared the Duke's pity. The gossip thickened with each retelling, and soon it reached his cousin, Captain Lionel Avery, a man whose charm was matched only by his envy. Lionel arrived unannounced one afternoon, his boots polished, his voice loud enough to fill the manor. He greeted her with mock gallantry, bowing low. "So this is the quiet enchantress," he said. "The one who keeps our dear Duke company?" She lowered her gaze, her silence an answer of dignity. He chuckled. "How convenient, not to answer a question one dislikes." When the Duke entered, Lionel's tone changed to false warmth. "My dear cousin, you keep interesting company. Tell me, does she sing for you in the evenings?" The Duke's expression hardened. He signed something curtly, which Lionel ignored. "I forget myself," he said lightly. "Forgive me." Old habits of jest. But his eyes gleamed with mischief. After he left, the Duke remained by the window for a long time, the sunset spilling over his shoulders like fire. She wanted to thank him for his restraint, for not shaming her before his kin. But how could she? Her gratitude had no voice. Instead, she placed the music box on the piano in the drawing-room and wound it carefully. The melody filled the space, delicate and trembling. He turned toward the sound, watching her lips form a single word he could not hear. "Thank you." He smiled, not with amusement, but with quiet recognition. He crossed the room and touched the box gently, letting the notes vibrate beneath his hand. Later that night, alone in her room, she watched lightning crawl across the distant hills. The storm rolled in heavy and slow, the air thick with anticipation. From her window, she saw a lone figure standing by the river, coat billowing in the wind. The Duke, unbothered by rain. He lifted his face toward the storm, unhearing, unafraid, and for the first time she felt the strange pull of connection, sharp as longing, deep as pain, the knowledge that silence could be shared, and in that sharing, become something more than absence. But beneath the beauty of that moment, a shadow stirred. For not far beyond the manor walls, Lionel's horse waited, its rider watching the windows with a calculating gaze. In the heart of Whitmore Hall, two souls had begun to find each other through silence, unaware that the world was already preparing to speak against them. The evening wind moved through Whitmore Hall like a whisper from the plains, soft, uneasy, filled with secrets. Candles flickered along the corridor walls, their light spilling across portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The woman walked with deliberate quiet, her steps barely audible on the oak floor, her mind troubled by what she had overheard that afternoon. Lionel's voice, sharp with resentment, and the Duke's reply, cool but strained, they had argued in the library. She had lingered outside the door, unseen, catching fragments through the wood. "You cannot keep her here," Lionel had said. "Already the town mocks your silence and hers. It's indecent." The Duke's answer came measured, each word deliberate. "If decency demands cruelty, I'll have none of it." It was then that Lionel's voice had turned venomous. "You mistake loneliness for affection, cousin. She reminds you of the one you lost." That's all. The door had creaked then, and she had fled before they could see her. But the words lingered like thorns beneath her skin. That night, unable to sleep, she lit a candle and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Did she remind him of another woman? Of the wife whose portrait hung in the West Hall, the same haunting face she'd seen on her first day, pale and graceful, eyes filled with melancholy. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and slipped into the hallway. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the great clock below. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, past the parlor, the music room, until she reached the library door. It was ajar, the faint scent of tobacco and rain lingering within. Inside, the fire had burned low, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and there, beside the hearth, sat the Duke, still dressed from supper, coat unbuttoned, his posture weary. He did not see her at first. His eyes were fixed on a small leather-bound journal resting on his knee, his lips moving silently as his fingers traced the page. She hesitated in the doorway, then gently stepped forward. The floorboard gave a soft sigh beneath her weight. He looked up instantly, eyes alert, hand tightening around the book. When he recognized her, his expression softened. He gestured toward the chair opposite him, and she obeyed. The fire crackled between them. He closed the journal carefully, setting it aside. Then, with a faint smile, he signed, "You cannot sleep either," she nodded. He regarded her for a long moment, his gaze searching, and then, perhaps deciding the hour was too late for formalities, he spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, touched by a faint accent from his English years. "Do you know why I built this house so far from town?" She shook her head. "Because the world is too loud," he said simply. "Noise has a way of finding even those who cannot hear it. Gossip, pity, pretension. I came here for quiet. But even silence can be cruel when one is alone." He rose, crossing to the shelves. The firelight caught in his hair, glinting silver. He retrieved a small key from his pocket and turned toward the far wall, where a panel of dark wood bore no handle. With a soft click, the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. He glanced back at her, eyes unreadable. "Would you see where silence lives?" She hesitated only a moment before nodding. The staircase led to a chamber beneath the house, cool and dim. At its center stood a large desk, its surface covered with mechanical parts, gears, springs, and tiny clockwork tools, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Along the walls hung sketches of intricate designs, a carriage without horses, a windmill that turned without wind. But what caught her eye was the object resting in the corner, a small piano, its keys yellowed with age, wires replaced by fine silver threads. He approached it reverently. "I built this to feel music," he said, pressing a key. The mechanism stirred. Vibrations trembled through the floorboards. "I cannot hear the sound, but I can see its rhythm, feel it beneath my hands." The music box was only the beginning. She stepped closer, fingertips brushing the polished wood. Her heart ached with admiration. He, too, had sought a way to give form to the silence, to make it beautiful instead of empty. He turned toward her, expression grave now. "There are things I never speak of. This room, it was once my wife's sanctuary. She used to play here while I pretended to hear. When the fever took my hearing, I lied. I told her I could still listen, that her music reached me somehow. But she knew. And one night she stopped playing." He looked down, voice tightening. A month later, she was gone. The words hung heavy in the air. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that grief could live quietly and still be love. But her throat closed around the thought. Instead, she reached for his hand. He startled slightly at the contact, then relaxed. Her fingers spelled slow, careful words upon his palm. "You still listen, just differently." His eyes widened, then softened with a warmth that startled them both. For a long time, neither moved. The fire above groaned in the flue, thunder murmured in the distance. Between them, something fragile took root, an understanding beyond sound or speech. Then footsteps echoed faintly from above. The Duke stiffened, extinguishing the lantern. "We are not alone," he whispered. They climbed the steps in silence, emerging once more into the library. The door stood ajar now, and the faint smell of cigar smoke lingered in the air. On the table lay a single calling card, Lionel's, marked with a careless flourish. The Duke's jaw tightened. He crushed the card in his fist and cast it into the fire. She touched his arm gently, trying to ease the tension, but his expression remained hard. "He would see this house destroyed if it pleased his vanity," he said. "He despises what he cannot understand." He turned to her then, searching her face with a gaze that saw too much. "Does my silence frighten you?" She shook her head slowly. He studied her a moment longer. "Then promise me this. You will not let his words break what peace you found here." Her eyes glistened. She signed carefully. Peace does not live in walls. It lives where one is seen. For the first time he smiled, not politely, but with quiet, genuine affection. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we have both been blind until now." She wanted to answer, to tell him how his kindness had begun to stir life in her again. But before she could, lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the portrait of his late wife above the mantel. The resemblance between them struck her anew, the same dark hair, the same fragile grace. The Duke followed her gaze, expression unreadable. "You see it too," he murmured. "Her face in yours." Her heart clenched, uncertain whether it was comfort or curse. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming gently upon the roof. She rose, meaning to retreat before the moment grew too heavy, but his voice stopped her. "Stay a while longer," he said quietly. Let the storm pass, and so they sat together in the glow of the dying fire. Two wounded souls, bound by silence, unaware that from the darkened hall beyond the door, Lionel Avery stood watching, his hand clenched, his jealousy sharpening into resolve. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one now gathering within Whitmore Hall. The dawn came reluctantly, its pale light spilling across the windows of Whitmore Hall like a confession that could not be withheld. The rain had passed in the night, leaving behind a silence so heavy that every sound, the creak of a door, the echo of footsteps, seemed charged with meaning. The woman awoke to the distant clang of metal and hurried whispers beyond her chamber door. Something in the air had changed. She dressed quickly, wrapping her shawl tight, and stepped into the corridor. Servants scurried like startled birds, avoiding her gaze. At the foot of the stairs stood Mrs. Alcott, face pale, her composure cracking. "You should remain in your room," the housekeeper said softly, blocking her path. The woman shook her head, gesturing in question. Mrs. Alcott hesitated, eyes flickering toward the drawing room. "There's been an incident," she murmured. "His Grace's cousin has raised a matter most grave." Before she could press further, the door to the drawing room burst open. Lionel Avery strode out, boots gleaming, coat immaculate despite the early hour. In his hand he held a velvet pouch, and his expression carried the smug calm of a man who had waited long to play his hand. "There she is," he said coolly, "the quiet one." The Duke followed behind him, face drawn, eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. He glanced at her, his look filled with confusion and disbelief, then turned sharply toward Lionel. "What game is this?" he demanded, his voice low but trembling with restrained fury. "No game, cousin," Lionel replied. He loosened the drawstring of the pouch, spilling its contents across the table. Pearls, glinting gold, and a silver brooch shaped like a bird mid-flight. "Your late wife's jewels," he said. "Missing these 3 nights past. And now, miracle of miracles, found in the lady's drawer." A murmur swept through the servants gathered in the hall. The woman froze, color draining from her face. She looked from the jewels to the Duke, then back again, lips parting in shock, hands trembling as she reached out in denial. Lionel's voice sharpened. "Do not play innocent. I found them myself this morning while checking upon her welfare at your request." The Duke's brow furrowed. He looked at her, truly looked, and she saw in his eyes not accusation, but the terrible uncertainty of a man who longed to believe. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, her throat closed. She tried to form the words, but nothing came. She shook her head vehemently, gesturing wildly, pointing toward Lionel, then to herself, then to the heavens, as though truth might descend and vindicate her. Lionel watched with a sneer. How convenient. No words, no defense. A thief who hides behind her silence. The Duke's fist struck the table, rattling the jewels. "Enough," he growled. "This is not justice, it's theater." Lionel's tone turned mocking. "Justice, cousin, is seldom pleasant. Or are you too besotted to see deceit when it stares at you?" The Duke stepped forward, fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. His voice was quiet now, dangerous. "You will leave this matter to me." Lionel inclined his head in mock deference. "Of course, though the law may not share your romantic leniency," he turned to the servants. "You all heard. The evidence speaks for itself." He departed, leaving the house thick with tension. The Duke stood motionless for several moments. Then, without a word, he gathered the scattered jewels and set them carefully aside. His gaze lifted to her, weary but steady. "You must tell me," he said softly, his lips forming each word with care so she could read them. "If you know how." Her hands trembled as she signed rapidly, the movements clumsy with panic. He struggled to follow, catching fragments. "Not me." "Planted, Lionel." But her gestures dissolved into tears before she could finish. He crossed to her and took her wrists gently, steadying her trembling hands. "I believe you," he said at last. But belief may not be enough. At those words she broke. The first sob tore free, raw, soundless, yet more eloquent than any plea. She clutched the edge of his coat as if to anchor herself against the rising tide of disgrace. He drew her into his arms, his touch tentative at first, then sure. "We will find the truth," he murmured. "But you must trust me, no matter what happens." By afternoon, word had reached the village. The scandal spread like wildfire, the mute woman who'd stolen jewels from the deaf Duke. Peddlers whispered it along the road. Servants carried it to the tavern, and by dusk, even the church bell seemed to toll her condemnation. That night she packed her few belongings in silence. On the table lay the music box he had given her, still gleaming faintly in the lamplight. She wound it once, letting the melody drift softly through the room, her farewell, her confession, her proof of gratitude. Then she placed it upon his desk with a folded note. In careful handwriting she wrote, "I will not make you choose between silence and reputation." When dawn broke again, the house stirred to the sound of carriage wheels. The Duke entered his study moments too late. She was already gone. The note lay open before him, the ink smudged by a single tear. He read it once, twice, then pressed it to his chest. He rushed to the stables, shouting orders, his voice carrying farther than it had in years. The servants hesitated, unused to his command, but obeyed. Horses were saddled, the gate flung wide. He rode hard through the fields, the wind tearing at his coat, the chill cutting through his breath. The plain stretched vast and empty ahead, but he would find her. He had to. When he finally saw her figure on the ridge, walking against the dawn, something within him broke. He dismounted, calling her name, though he could not hear it. His lips shaped the sound in desperate repetition, his heart hammering louder than any thunder. She turned, startled, eyes wide. The sight of him, coat drenched in dew, hair disheveled, face streaked with anguish, stopped her where she stood. He closed the distance between them in seconds. Rain from the grass soaked their boots. Words were useless. Instead, he took her hands, guiding them gently to his chest, to the rhythm of his heart. Then he signed, slowly, painfully, his movements trembling, "If you leave, all will be quiet again. But I will never know peace." Her tears fell freely now. She tried to speak, but no sound came. So she answered in the only language they shared. She pressed her palm against his heart, feeling its rhythm beneath her touch. Behind them, the first light of morning crept across the land, gilding the wet fields in gold. Somewhere a church bell rang. The Duke could not hear it, but she felt it in the trembling of his body, in the thundering of his pulse, and for a moment silence became music once more. Neither saw the lone rider approaching from the distance. A letter clutched in his hand, proof of Lionel's deceit, and the storm of truth that was about to break. The night of the ball arrived beneath a sky trembling with snow, the air so cold it made the stars themselves seem brittle. Whitmore Hall stood ablaze with candlelight, its windows gleaming like 100 eyes turned toward the world. For the first time in years, music echoed through its corridors, violins, laughter, and the rustle of silk, and yet beneath the grandeur, tension coiled like a drawn bow. The Duke stood at the top of the staircase, immaculate in black and silver, his presence commanding, his composure precise. Beside him, the woman who had once arrived a castaway now descended with quiet grace, her gown the pale shade of moonlight, her hair swept up with a single pearl pin. The guests, merchants, officers, wives, and whisperers all fell into uneasy silence as she appeared. Even among those who prided themselves on civility, gossip had been their favorite sport. "There she is," murmured one matron behind a fan. "The mute bride." "A thief turned duchess," another whispered. "He must be mad." But if she heard, she gave no sign. Her eyes were calm, her bearing regal. She had learned that dignity was the only language cruelty could not translate. At the base of the stairs, the Duke offered his arm. Their eyes met. A brief exchange, silent yet suffused with meaning. "You are not alone." The orchestra began. The first strains of the waltz shimmered like frost in the air. The Duke led her on to the floor, and though he could not hear the rhythm, he moved with perfect poise, guided by her gentle pressure, by the flicker of her breath, by the way her body swayed in harmony with the unseen melody. For a moment the hall itself seemed to hold its breath. The guests watched, spellbound, not by spectacle, but by something deeper, quieter. Two figures dancing not in sound but in absolute understanding. The silence between them became a language that no music could rival. At the far end of the room, Lionel Avery stood with a glass of brandy, his expression unreadable. The forged letter, the one that had exposed his treachery, had arrived days before, carried by a messenger from town. The Duke had not confronted him directly. Instead, he had extended an invitation, a public reckoning, disguised as celebration. Now Lionel watched them with the cornered calm of a man who knows the ground beneath him is crumbling. When the waltz ended, the applause was hesitant, almost fearful. The Duke turned to face his guests, expression unyielding. He gestured for silence, though none was needed. The hush had already fallen. "I thank you all," he said, his voice steady, every word measured so that she could follow his lips. "You honor my home with your presence, and tonight I wish to honor someone else." He turned to her, her breath caught, the light trembling on her lashes. "This woman," he continued, "came to Whitmore Hall a stranger, cast aside by a world too eager to mistake quiet for weakness. You called her voiceless, yet she has spoken more truth through her silence than most do through a lifetime of noise." The crowd shifted uneasily. A murmur spread, quickly quelled. He stepped closer, his words gaining strength. "Some of you believed lies, lies spread by a man who carries my name but not my honor. Lionel's glass cracked in his hand. The sound was sharp, ugly. The Duke's gaze found him across the room. "Captain Avery, you claim to serve my family's good, yet it was your deceit that nearly destroyed it. I have here your own correspondence, proof of your theft, your scheme to discredit the woman who refused your advance." Gasps rippled through the room like wind through dry grass. Lionel's face blanched, then darkened with fury. "You have no right—" "I have every right," the Duke interrupted, voice like steel. "You conspired to disgrace her, to profit from slander, but you failed to understand that silence does not mean surrender." He turned to the woman beside him and offered his hand once more. "And now, before those who doubted, I will speak what my heart has known since the moment I saw her standing in the rain at Westmere Station." The crowd leaned forward. He signed each word slowly, deliberately, so she could see. And in the room's stunned quiet, the gestures themselves became poetry. "You are not my charity. You are my choice, my equal, my peace." Her eyes glistened. The ballroom blurred around her. The candles, the crowd, the storm of whispers, all fading into the background hum of her racing heart. She signed back, trembling but sure. "And you are my sound." It was then that Lionel lunged. The moment fractured like glass. The crowd scattered as the Duke turned sharply, stepping before her. The glint of steel flashed in Lionel's hand, a dueling dagger drawn from his coat. The weapon caught the light for a heartbeat. And then the Duke's cane struck, swift and hard, sending the blade skittering across the marble. Guards rushed forward, restraining Lionel as he spat curses, his pride shattering faster than his schemes. The Duke, unshaken, simply said, "Take him away." When the doors closed behind the disgraced cousin, a deep, tremulous quiet filled the hall. The Duke turned back to her, his breath steady, but his hands trembling faintly. "Forgive me," he said softly, "for letting," his voice wound you. She reached up, touched his cheek, and shook her head. Then, before the stunned assembly, she rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was not the kiss of ceremony or triumph. It was the kind of kiss that speaks what words cannot, that carries the ache of all that has been endured, and the fragile wonder of what remains. Around them no one dared breathe, and then the orchestra began again. The Duke extended his hand, and she took it. Together they stepped back onto the floor. The violins swelled, the chandeliers shimmered, and this time they moved, not in silence, but in the rhythm of a truth finally freed. Each turn of their dance seemed to erase the whispers that had shadowed them. Each motion drew light where darkness had lingered. The people watched, some weeping quietly, as if the sight itself had absolved them of their cruelty. When the last note faded, the Duke bent close, his voice a murmur only she could see. "The world may never learn to listen," he said, "but I will never stop." And she smiled through her tears, resting her hand over his heart, feeling the pulse that had once spoken for them both. Outside, the snow fell softly upon the plains, covering every scar of the past. Inside, in the heart of Westmere Hall, silence finally found its song.